Well, Sean and I have gotten to know each other, and as well as his lovely wife Kim, who's out here too, over the past few days, and it's really deeply a pleasure for me to be the one to be on this stage with you, and we're going to get things going. I know that Sean's going to open with the reading of, and he'll tell you exactly what he's going to read, and then we'll do a little talk between ourselves, then we're going to open it up for Q&A. All right.
All right. It was a pleasure meeting you and seeing and being with you this week. And the seminar was an incredible experience. And thank you so much for having us. Any excuse to come where it's warm in January is fine by me. It's so funny because I live in Virginia and people think Virginia is the South, and it is partly, but also Virginia has really cold mountains. And so I've been in both parts of that. So anytime to get out of that is fantastic. I'm going to read the first chapter of Razorblade Tears, and then I'm going to read the prologue of my book that comes out in June called All the Sinners Bleed. Funny thing about prologues, people say don't write them, but Dennis Lehane wrote one for Darkness Take My Hand. If it works for him, I'm going to do it too. So I'll read chapter 1 of Razorblade, and then immediately following will be the prologue from All the Sinners Bleed. Chapter 1. Ike tried to remember a time when men with badges coming to his door early in the morning brought anything other than heartache and misery, but try as he might, nothing came to mind. The two men stood side by side on the small concrete landing of his front step, with their hands on their belts near their badges and their guns. The relentless June sun made the badges glimmer like gold nuggets. The two cops were a studying contrast. One was tall, but wiry. He was an Asian man. He was all sharp angles and hard edges. The other one, a florid-faced white man, was built like a power lifter with a massive head sitting atop a wide neck. They both wore white dress shirts with clip-on ties. The power lifter had sweat stains spreading down from his armpits that vaguely resembled maps of England and Ireland, respectively. Ike's stomach did turgid somersaults. He was 15 years removed from Coldwater State Penitentiary. He had bucked the recidivism statistics ever since he'd walked out of that festering wound, not so much as a speeding ticket in all those years. Yet here he was, with his tongue dry and the back of his throat burning as the two cops stared at him. It was bad enough being a black man sometimes in the good old US of A and talking to the cops. You always felt like you were on the edge of some imaginary precipice during any interaction with an officer of the law. And if you were an ex-con, it felt like that precipice was covered in grease. Yes, Ike said. Sir, I'm Detective LaPlata. This is my partner, Detective Robbins. May we come in? What for? Ike asked. LaPlata sighed. It came out low and long like the bottom note in a blues song. Ike tensed. LaPlata glanced at Robbins. Robbins shrugged. LaPlata's head dipped down, then he raised it again. Ike had learned to pick up on body language when he was inside. There was no aggression in their stances, at least not any more than what most cops exuded on a normal 12-hour shift. The way LaPlata's head had dropped was almost sad. Sir, do you have a son named Isaiah Randolph? He said finally. And that was when he knew. He knew it like he knew when a fight was about to break out in the yard. Like he knew when somebody was going to stab him for a bag back in the day. Like he knew, just knew in his gut, that his homeboy Luther had seen his last sunset the night he'd gone home with that girl from the satellite bar. It was like a sixth sense, a preternatural ability to sense a tragedy seconds before it became a reality. What's happened to my son, Detective LaPlata? Ike asked, already knowing the answer. Knowing it in his bones. Knowing his life would never be the same. So that's the first chapter of that. And thank you. And then I'm going to read a section prologue from my next book, All the Sinners Bleed. And this is the prologue from that. Cherrin County. Cherrin County was founded in bloodshed and darkness, literally and figuratively. Even the name is enveloped in shadows and morbidity. Legend has it the name of the county was supposed to be Charlotte or Charles County, but the town elders waited too late, and those names were already taken by the time they had decided to incorporate their fledgling encampment. As the story goes, they just moved their finger down the list of names until they settled on Cherrin. Those men weathered as whipped leather, with hands like splitting mauls, bestowed the name on their new town with no regard to its necrophiliac nature. Or perhaps they just liked the name because a river flowed through the county and emptied into the Chesapeake like the river Styx. Who knows? Who could know the thoughts of those long dead men? What is known is that in 1805, in the dead of night, a group of landowners chafing at the limits of their own manifest destiny set fire to the last remaining indigenous village on that teardrop-shaped peninsula that would become Sharon County. Those who escaped the fire were brought down by musket balls with no regard to age, gender, or infirmity. And that was the first of many tragedies in the history of Sharon County. The cannibalism of the winter of 1853, the malaria outbreak of 1901, the Daughters of the American Revolutionary picnic poisoning of 1953, the Danforth family murder-suicide of 1967, the tent revival baptismal drownings of 1978, and on and on and on. The soil of Sharon County, like most towns and counties in the South, was sown with a generation of tears. They were places where violence and mayhem were celebrated as the pillars of a pioneering spirit every Founders Day in the county square. Blood and tears, violence and mayhem, love and hate. These were the rocks upon which the South was built. They were the foundation upon which Sharon County stood. If you had occasion to ask some of the citizens of Sharon, most of them would tell you those things were in the past, that they had been washed away by the river of time that flows ever forward. They might even say those things should be forgotten and left in the ages. But if you had asked Sheriff Titus Crown, he would have said that anyone who believed that was a fool or a liar or both. And if you had an occasion to speak with him after that long October in 2017, he would have told you that maybe the foundations of Sharon were rotten and fetid and full of corruption. Not only corruption of the flesh, but of the soul. That maybe the rocks the South were built upon were shifting and splitting like the stone Moses struck with his staff. But instead of water, only blood and ichor would come pouring forth. He might even touch the scars on his face or his chest and lock eyes with you and say in that harsh whisper that was now his speaking voice, "The South doesn't change. You can try to hide the past, but it comes back in ways worse than it was before. Terrible ways." He might sigh, look away, and say, "No, the South doesn't change. Just the names and the dates and the faces. And sometimes even those don't change. Not really. Sometimes it's the same day and the same faces waiting for you when you close your eyes. Waiting for you in the dark."
Thank you, Sean. Of course, we've gotten to know each other, and I've asked you some of these questions already, so bear with me. I mean, that's what the literary seminar was all about for me, talking to the writers I admire the most. But I read a quote of yours in an interview that you did with The Guardian that really impressed me. And it talks about what you call the Holy Trinity of Southern fiction. And I'd like you to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so that's a quote that originated with a group of friends of mine who are Southern writers, grit-lit writers, as some people call us. And, the Holy Trinity of Southern fiction, I believe, is the race, class, and sex. All those things come together and swirl around each other to create what is the foundation of Southern fiction. Whether it's William Faulkner or Harry Crews or Ernest J. Gaines, all those things create sort of this panoply that we call Southern fiction. And I think it's because, to paraphrase a quote from Flannery O'Connor, the South isn't Christ-centered, but it's Christ-haunted. I think it's haunted by Christian hypocrisy, and Christian hypocrisy creates this sort of dichotomy between what is acceptable and what is allowable. So for every minister that hoops and holler in a church on Sunday morning, that same minister goes and plays the lottery Saturday night. And so for every church picnic that you have, there's a shot house, and the same people are usually in both places. And so the hypocrisy and duality of Southern fiction I think is expressed in those three things. And I think the great writers of Southern fiction understood that and are able to use that as the basis for their work. And it's the same basis that I try to use when I write. And they're also interconnected. Race and class are both, I think, two sides of the same coin. Sexuality is a part of that. I have a cousin who inspired Raised by Tears, who said, in the South, if you have a skill, if you can be a hairdresser or you can lead a church choir, no one cares that you're gay. But if you can't do one of those two things, if you're not useful to the community, then it's an abomination to them. I think that sexuality becomes even more interesting when you talk about the intersection of race, and that there's people who have learned to pass for a different race in the South, and unfortunately that sometimes that was a necessity. And so those are always things that I think are important to talk about when you're talking about Southern fiction. I'm very proud to be a Southern writer. I don't take that as an insult. Virginia is my heart and my home. But to paraphrase another great writer, James Baldwin, because Virginia, the South is my home, I love it. And because I love it, I reserve the right to criticize it, because I understand that it can be a better version of itself.
Well, I also like that you are taking on such things that a lot of other black writers are just kind of tentatively grasping, and that's things that have been kind of taboo in the black community, and that is like homosexuality, for that as one thing, and stripping and the porn industry and all these things that we think we're a little too righteous to deal with. But you've created characters that are not only likable, but believable and earnest and hardworking. And I think that we should start embracing some of what we considered outliers before, don't you?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, the strippers and the porn stars are just the candy to come get you to read the book. That's the honey, the medicine is the subtext. But no, I think for me, characters, I'm very bored by perfect characters. I hate that the unlikable character has become shorthand for a female character that you think is, B-I-T-C-H. And so for me, those characters that are broken, that are, damaged, are the ones that are the most interesting to me. Someone said, it might have been you at the seminar, that, you write about the characters that are down in the dirt, and that's where the best stories are. I just think that telling those stories is also sort of my duty, before... I don't want this to sound like I'm taking credit for this, but before I started writing my books, I didn't see a lot of books about the lived-in rural black experience of a modern time. Right. It's always a story that takes place in 1935 or 1940, and so like me and my wife like to joke that we were kids, we watched the movie Sounder in school, and it's like I used to say that's not a movie to me. I was living that. That's a documentary, and so I wanted to write about the modern experience and talk about people who are people that I grew up with, my uncles, my aunts, my cousins, my friends, and whether it's Bug in Black Tie Wasteland, who owns a garage like my cousin did, or whether it's somebody like or Buddy Lee. Like Buddy Lee is basically every kid I went to school with, dad or uncle. Mm-hmm. I know these people, and I know them in all their imperfections, and that for me is interesting. If I want to read about perfect people, I'll read fairy tales. I just feel like as a writer, it's your duty to create characters that people can identify and empathize with. But I think empathy is not endorsement. And sometimes I think people confuse that. I empathize with Bug. I empathize with Ike and Buddy Lee. That doesn't mean you should go out and beat somebody over the head with a toilet tank top. But some people,
you're gonna keep reminding
some people need an ass whooping sometimes. But I'm not endorsing violence.
Yes.
But I think that's very important. I think the characters are what make the story.
I think something that people may not know about you is that you have branched out into a couple of other genres. You always return to that which you do so well. But I've read short stories of yours in horror anthologies. Is the line between horror and crime fiction close enough? Because you choreograph some of your crime novels and the scenes are horrific. So
I have a good friend named Ed Kurtz who's a writer, and he said that horror and crime are kissing cousins. I definitely think that's true. I mean, I started out wanting to be a horror writer. I was a huge Stephen King and Clive Barker fan when I was a kid, Richard Matheson, Lovecraft. I think if if you're a kid of a certain age in the 90s, and I was a big Poe fan. I used to have a girlfriend that was a goth. So it was like all of that kind of went hand in. Oh, that was a funny story too. She came to pick me up to go to the movies one night, and we were living with my grandparents because my mom and my brother and I, our house had burned down, so we were living with my grandma. And she comes to the door. I'll never forget it. We're going to see the Doors movie. And she comes to the door, and she was wearing a black wedding dress with a black veil. And she pulls the veil up and is like, "Hi, I'm here for Sean." And my grandma would come back in the house. And she's like, "Sean, there's a witch here that wants to see you." And she gave me like a little pocket Bible when I left. She's like, "Take this with you." And I was like, "No, it's not. Oh, never mind. It don't matter." But I think I always wanted to write horror. But for me, I think it's interesting when you find your, I don't want to use the word tribe, when you find your niche. You know, I was really trying to write horror. I'd written a couple of horror novels and stuff, and nothing clicked. And I wrote a fantasy novel, I wrote a sci-fi novel, and just nobody was interested. Nobody was picking it up. And then I had a friend who, it sounds like this is a fake story, but I swear to God it's true. I had a friend who's a belly dancer, and she went to New York City. And after her performance, she went to this bar in the East Village. And in the bar was the guy who was the manager, this gentleman named Todd Robinson, who is an incredible figure in crime fiction and modern crime fiction in America. And he was running a quarterly magazine called Thug Lit. And she was telling him that I was having a hard time getting my stories published. And he told her, he said, "Well, look, I don't know if he wants to write crime stories, but I'll pay $100. And she came home and told me that, and I really needed that $100. And so I was going to Coinstar for gas at the time. And so I was like, well, I love crime stories. I didn't see a lot of crime stories set where I grew up. You know, at that time, I knew of Daniel Woodrell and folks like that, but I hadn't really experienced their work. So I sat down and wrote this story called The Rat and the Cobra, about these two brothers fighting over an inheritance. And I think for me, what separates rural crime from sometimes more esoteric types of crime stories is that on the outside looking in, the stakes don't look that impressive. You know, it's a house. What are you fighting for? But if you grew up like I did, dirt floor, poor, a house is everything. You know, a house. I didn't have running water until I was 16, so a house means everything to me. And so I wrote the story, sent it in. He published it, and I got that $100, and I had gas money for the week. And I wrote another crime story, and he published that one, and I wrote another one. And then by the fifth one, I realized, well, you know, I'm okay at this. Like these stories are actually selling. They're starting to get some attention, and so I never lost my love of horror. I still read a lot of horror. As you said, I've written some horror. I've been very privileged to be in Orphans of Bliss and Other Voices, Other Terrors, and I have a horror story coming out this fall in a collection called the Drive-In.
That was my next question. Don't go away from it.
Yeah. I have a story coming out in the Drive-In, which is a tribute to Joe Lansdale, which I got to meet him, and it was like, oh man, I can't believe, he's such a cool guy. Joe Lansdale is an incredible guy. I got to see him. So Joe Lansdale is a 6th-degree black belt in karate, and I got to see him like take people down in the lobby at a convention. It was the greatest thing ever. But so I've always had that love of horror. I don't know, like it's funny though, because I think once you start in a particular genre and you find success there, it is hard to branch out. I think in one of many Stephen King stories I told over the weekend, but I love this story where Stephen King was talking about, he published Carrie, and then he published Salem's Lot. And his third option for his next book was going to be either The Shining or a crime novel called Blaze. And he went to his agent, and the agent was like, well, both of them are good, but The Shining is better, and I really hate that. And Stephen King was like, why? He says, because you're going to be branded as a horror writer. And he says in his book on writing, I was very naive, and I said, oh no, I'll be able to write whatever I want. And, he's a horror master now. And so I think it is difficult to get out of those genres, but I think I'll always dabble in them because I really love horror, and I think it's just like crime fiction. I think horror and crime fiction are the gospel of the dispossessed.
And they make really great anthologies too, because you get a chance to see a lot of writers.
Exactly, definitely.
Now, I'd like to ask you, again, we've talked about this, but I'm sure you'd like to share it, who not the influences are on your writing, because you write in a genre that's new and upcoming. We have some of the other black crime writers writing what I call urban noir, but you're writing more of a southern noir or a rural noir. Yeah. So aside from Faulkner and people like that in that genre, tell me a little bit about the other crime writers in general who might have influenced your work, or if not influenced your work, who you just love to read.
No, definitely. I think there's the three main ones for me. if you wanted to ask me, like, who's on my Mount Rushmore, is Elmore Leonard, Walter Mosley, and Dennis Lehane.
Okay.
When I was growing up, Walter Mosley especially was somebody, I read the first Easy Rawlins book and I was instantly hooked. And I was like, here are characters who look like me and they talk like the people I know. And it showed me that, that you could create a story with black lead characters and black villains. I think that's also important, that, that the villain that black characters don't have to be morally pure, that they can have shades of gray and complexity. And so Walter Mosley was a huge influence on me. And then Dennis Lehane is just one of the great dialogue writers of all time, whether it's crime or anything else. He has such an innate ear for the rhythm of conversation. And I make no bones that I try to steal that all the time. But, and then Elmore Leonard, it's like Elmore Leonard is just, he's the working man's crime writer. He gets up, he writes, 250 pages, and it's so tight and so razor sharp, no wasted motion. And so those are the writers that I initially wanted to emulate, wanted to be like. But over the years, I found other writers that influenced me as well. And the funny thing about writing now and being able to do this at this time is that I've gotten to be friends with a lot of these folks. I've met Walter Mosley, I've met Dennis Lehane. A good friend of mine named Jordan Harper just released a book called Everybody Knows, and he's a fantastic writer. And I've got to hang out with him. Or Eli Craner is a great writer. He released a book called Don't Know Tough. Takes place in Arkansas. And so I think there is this great new crime fiction movement in general, but there is also a very specific new South or Southern rural crime movement that's coming up that I think is the idea that modern writers are wrestling with the same issues that have always faced the South, but through new and interesting prisms, through whether it's me as an African American man writing, or whether it's someone who's LGBTQ. Like a friend of mine, Kelly J. Ford, who wrote a great book called Cottonmouth. And so she's writing as an LGBTQ woman with an LGBTQ lead. And so you're doing that conversation. You're still talking about the Trinity, but you're talking about it in a way that I think is way more open and way more inclusive. And I think that's important. But yeah, if you had told me 10 years ago that I was going to have Walter Mosley's number in my cell phone, I would have directed you to the nearest psychiatrist. And so it's like, it's one of those things. I never ever take any of this for granted. I never do. People ask me, like, do you get upset by bad reviews? And I'm like, man, I used to work a job in construction where I had to carry 60-pound bags of concrete up 3 flights of scaffolding. Bad review ain't nothing. And I was like, hey, that's the worst part of my day? Psh, you fine, I'm good. It's like, I used to be so sore to that job, I had to use the Zorbine Senior. And so it's like...
And let me ask you a question that may be a little sensitive, but I'd like you to think about it and answer it. Have other black authors criticized you because you write criminal characters, and we are often afraid of being criminalized?
I will tell you a story, and I won't mention who the author is, because I'm a nice Southern boy,
I'll get it out of you. I'll ask him.
Wait till I go to Duval Street, they get to ask me. No, so there was a writer, black writer, who's a very well-known literary writer. I'm going to give you all a hint, and if you know who it is, just don't say anything. They've won a bunch of awards. They have a book that's entitled with the name of a monetary denomination set in Florida. And you might know what I'm talking about. So anyway, my very first book had been sent around to different artists and writers, and everybody was getting it great blurbs. Walter Mosley gave it a great blurb. He called me a new American voice of crime fiction. And Dennis Lehane, Lee Child gave it. I got a funny Lee Child story I'll tell you later. But anyway, so they sent it to this person, and he was like, I just don't want to contribute to the stereotypical presentation of black men in crime novels. And I was like, you haven't read the book, if that's what you think is going on at Black Tie Wasteland. And so I was like, all right, that's fine, whatever, man, that's cool. So fast forward 5 years, that person wrote a crime novel set in Harlem. Where people were shuffling. And and he sent an email to my editor asking me would I blurb it. And I said, I don't want to contribute to the stereotypical criminalization. But in their writer's defense, I will say that a couple weeks later, they sent me an email apologizing. So I thought that was really nice. Well, also, I think they did that because Obama put my book on his list. So.
Yes, say that again and tell it the way you really say it. What list was that?
Obama's summer reading list had Razorblade Tears on it. So.
That's right. How many times did you tell me that over the past 4
Oh
days?
gosh, I'll never stop talking about it. I'll be 75 years old getting a speeding ticket, and I'll still talk about it. Like, sir, do you know how fast you're going? No, but I was on Obama's summer reading list.
I know that Kim is back there, your wife, and your family is Southern based, and do you have any desire to see a little bit more of the world, move other places, or are you happy being a Southern boy?
I think, it's so funny. I love being able to travel. I mean, we've been in New York. Like this last year, I've been to Minneapolis, Seattle, New York, Dallas, parts of the South in Durham, South Carolina, North Carolina, I should say. I was here this week. I was in England in April. It's funny. I don't know if I'll ever move permanently, but I do like the idea of having like an F. Scott Fitzgerald room in a hotel in New York that we just go to all the time. I like that idea. I think I'm too much of I think I'm just too much of a country boy to go permanently somewhere else. I like waking up in the morning and looking out on my deck and seeing these squirrels that my wife hates that I surreptitiously feed that she doesn't want me to, and seeing a deer walk across the backyard and stuff like that. But I'll never be not amazed at the places words have taken me. I literally was a kid that grew up, wearing my brother's hand-me-downs, and we lived at my grandmother's house, and then we got our trailer, and my mom was disabled very young when I was a kid, and so we struggled a lot. I like to say, we used to eat the whole loaf of bread, the heels and all, and so I never imagined any of this would happen. I always knew I wanted to be a writer. My mother, so I'll tell you how everybody says, when did you want to be a writer? So when I was 6 or 7, my mother was still reading me stories or telling me stories, Three Little Pigs and all that, Red Riding Hood, and I would point at the plot holes in the story. So I'll be like, why didn't the pigs just build their first house of bricks? And so stuff like that. And what I thought was encouragement, what I realized now was my mom was frustrated with me because she's like, why don't you just write your own story and then you do what you want? And I was like, all right. So I wrote this story about these gnomes and these elves fighting these time travelers in our backyard in a magnolia tree. And I wrote it and I let her see it. And it was terrible. It's awful. But the look on her face when she was reading it, because she kept looking at it and looking at me and looking at it, and she's like, did you come up with all, And I was like, yeah. She's like, you didn't take this one? I said, no, I just made it up. And she's like, this is pretty good. I mean, it was terrible, but it was also good enough that...
No, it probably wasn't terrible. It was a fledgling effort. Give yourself some credit.
But I'll tell you, the look on her face is the high that I'm always still chasing. Because, it's that first moment that you realize, this is my thing, this is the thing I can do. And people always ask me, like, when did you know you're a writer? Or how do you feel about writing? Writing comes easy to me, but it's not easy work, I just feel like it's the most natural thing I can do. I've had a ton of jobs, and I've hated all of them. And but writing is the one thing that makes me happy. It's the one thing that I can lean on and depend on, and even in the worst of times, writing, I hope, never leaves me. My mom passed away last year, and she got to see a little bit of this stuff. And it was so funny because she was a character. And so Blacktop Wasteland is dedicated to my father. It's my love letter to my dad. And Raise Late Tears is dedicated to my mom. And so she was in hospice, and I went to see her. And I said, hey, Mom, I got the proofs from the book. I want to show you something. So I showed her where I dedicated the book to her. And she's like, oh, that's nice. She paused for a second. You should have dedicated Blacktop Wasteland to me, too. But I think, for me, it's just the thing that I never feel more alive than when I'm writing. And it's never as good on the page as it is in my head, And so I'm always chasing that, too. I'm always trying to get better, and I want to grab that.
Well, I think you're sitting in the catbird seat right now, because we're all sitting here loving your work. And I think we have time for a few questions.
We brought some students here for the seminar and to see you. What kind of student were you, and what advice did you give to our young writers?
I was a terrible student. I was awful. Because I got bored quickly, and I was always trying to be funny in class and stuff. And so my mom she was always so angry with me because I would always get those reports like, he has so much potential if he would just get organized. And I'm like, I'm not going to do that. But I had a teacher who is actually in the dedication of my first book, My Darkest Prayer, Mr. Jeff Bone. He was my 11th grade English teacher. And one day he gave us an assignment that we had to take a classic work of literature and rewrite the ending. So I got Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and I made it this very knockdown, drag-out fight between Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And, like, they had actually split into two different people, and they had a fist fight, and somebody got stabbed with a poker. And so after class, he asked me to stay behind, and I was so scared because I thought I was in trouble. And he said to me, have you considered, like, what are your plans after high school? And I was like, I don't really know. I knew my mom didn't have money to send me to college. I figured I'd just go, you know, in our town, the big industry is the Newport News Naval Shipyard. A lot of people get jobs there. So I was like, I'll just probably work at a shipyard or something. He's like, I think you should consider writing. You have a real unique voice. And I didn't know what he meant by that. So I thought he was talking about my voice because it was in the middle of changing. And I was like, well, that's not very nice. He said, no, your voice as a writer. I was like, oh, okay. And so he gave me that year, at the end of that term, he gave me 2 books, and I still have them. He gave me Strunk and White's Elements of Style, and he gave me the collected works of Samuel Beckett. And he said, one will teach you how to write, and the other will teach you why you write. So fast forward 30 years, he's retired. Him and his wife are traveling the world. The last I heard, they were in Bulgaria. And I was doing a book signing in my hometown of Matthews County, Virginia. You know, yay, Virginia, 2 up, 2 down. And so I hadn't seen him, like I said, since I graduated. And I'm sitting there. So when I would get in trouble in class, the way he would get our attention or make us stop, he was like, Mr. Cosby, do I have your attention? He would say it real loud. And I'm like, yeah. So we would stop talking or whatever. And I was in this little room doing the book signing, and I heard this voice at the door. It was like, I get emotional thinking about it. It was like, Mr. Cosby, do I have your attention? And I looked up, and he was standing in the door. And I started crying, and he started crying. But I can't tell you the importance of teachers in my life. Mr. Bone, Miss Lolita Payton, Miss Virginia Handy. These are teachers that really believed in me as a student, as a writer, people that helped open my mind to, like, what writing could do. And so the only thing I would tell students is read the books that people think you shouldn't read. Those are the ones that you need to be reading, because the safe stuff is not going to help you learn about writing. If the safe stuff is not going to give you the insights you're looking for. Anything somebody tells you you shouldn't read, that's exactly what you should be reading. Yep, right there.
Your Lee Child story.
Oh yeah, okay, so it's funny. So I was actually in St. Petersburg in 2018, and I was down there for an event called BoucherCon. It's a big world mystery convention. And I mean, and when I say world, it's world, like Joe Nesbo is there, and Adrian McKinney, everybody's there. So for this, before I start the story, you have to know 2 things that I didn't know. 1, Lee Child is English. He's from the UK. And 2, he's 6'8". He's 6'8". He's tall as one of these palm trees. And so we're in this hotel in St. Petersburg, beautiful hotel, and a bunch of my friends who are all now very successful writers, and that gives me such joy. But we were nobodies then. Nobody knew who we were. Nobody was spit on us to put us on fire. And so we're in the bar, and one of my friends was like, I'm going to go round up our little group. And I said, well, I'll stay here and man this table, make sure nobody gets the table. So the table's right next to the bar. I'm standing by the bar waiting for them to come back. This very tall, polite Englishman comes over, and he's trying to get the bartender's attention. And he's being very UK about it, and I realize that now because I've been to England. It's super polite, passive-aggressively in a way. But and so he was like, ma'am, I'd like a drink, please, ma'am, please. And she was not hearing him. And I was like, do you want a drink, man? He's like, yeah, I'm trying to get a scotch. So I have a very deep voice, and I'm not going to yell the way I yell there because the microphone is right in my mouth. But I was like, hey! And she turned around and she came over, and she was like, what do you want? And I was like, oh, this gentleman wants a drink. And he's like, oh, let me buy you a drink. I said, no, man, I'm good. My friends are coming over. About that time, my friends broke the corner, and one of them stopped, and like their face was like all wide-eyed, and they was like, oh my God, you know Lee Child? And I was like, no, but I hope he's here because I want him to sign my book. And he tapped me on my shoulder, and I looked up, he's like, I'm Lee Child. And he was so nice to us. He bought us a round of drinks, and he was the nicest guy. And then like, he blurred my book like 2 years later. So. Yes, ma'am, you had a question?
When you're writing a book, at what point in the book do you kind of know the ending?
So you're going to get a different answer to this question from different writers. I have writer friends who are pantsers. They just go by the seat of their pants, and they just write and see where the story takes. I cannot do that. I am too anxiety-ridden for that. So a lot of times what I do is I will write, before I start a book, if I have an idea for a story, I'll write like a 3 or 4 page synopsis to myself. and it's just a stream of consciousness. Bug does this, he needs money, da, 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 da. And so a lot of times the ending of the synopsis is nothing like the ending of the book, but it gives me a roadmap to follow. You know, for me, writing is like, it's like trying to find your way into a house, you know, and then synopsis is sort of the key for me. And so I'll write that, and I'll refer to the synopsis as I write. Sometimes the ending stays the same, sometimes it doesn't. Like the ending for Black Tar Wasteland is way different than synopsis. Same thing with Razorly Tears. But those synopsises, plural synopsis, they they give me a way to kind of get into the story, kind of see where I want to go. Mm-hmm. Anybody else?
Okay. I guess we're going to wrap it up then. And I have to tell you, Sean, it's been an honor to get to know you a little better over these next 4 days, and I promise not to turn into a stalker, but I'm certainly...
I got two, so you can just join the group.
I'm certainly going to follow your work. You can believe that. I'm certainly going to be keeping an eye out, even for the little horror stories that pop up every now and then, but certainly for these other books. And
thank you so much.
I'm not supposed to have favorites at the literary seminar, but I do, and I'm not going to mention any names. So. But I did, and I do, and I thank you for coming here and sharing with us for the seminar and sharing with the library group, and we'll be happy to see you come back.
I'd love to come back. Thank you so much. Thank you.